Rupert, good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I just wanted you to talk to me a little bit about the book. What is Secrecy about? Where is it set? Just general content.
Secrecy is set in Florence, and it's Florence in a very dark time. So the glories of the Renaissance have long gone. The Medici line is dying out. This is far from the Renaissance. This is a time when the city is repressive and dark. And in my mind, when I was writing it, a bit like America in the Prohibition, in a way, in the sense that because everything's forbidden, anything's possible. I was aware, as long ago, probably 10 years ago, that I was in possession of a kind of idea that looked like a historical novel. And historical novels as such, don't really interest me. I mean, I don't even think of novels as historical novels. If I'm reading The Leopard by Lampedusa or, The Master of Petersburg by Coetzee, I don't think I'm reading a historical novel, I just think I'm reading a novel. So my approach was, it was a strange approach really, because I ignored all the history to start with. I wrote 2 or 3 drafts of the book without knowing anything at all. It's about a wax modeler, about an artist who arrives in Florence. That's 3 or 4 things already that I knew nothing about. So you might think, well, what you would do is start with the research, research wax modelling, research art in the 17th century, research the 17th century, for God's sake, because I knew nothing about it. So, but no, I think the thing for me is I have to isolate first. I have to work out what the story is, what the psychology is, what the narrative drives, where that's going to come from. So I wrote 2 or 3 drafts, blind, as it were, just trying to find out what the story was. And by doing that, I worked out what it was I needed to know.
You tend to write multiple drafts for all of your novels.
I do. I write multiple drafts for every book. In the case of Secrecy, I think I wrote 10, which is 10 from beginning to end. So there's this pile of paper in my study that's about that high, with all the drafts, and probably wrote 2 more at galley-proof stage as well, where I went through it again. The reason being is that I sort of see writing as a bit like, I see it as like sculpture in one sense. You start out with some area of interest, something interests you, but you don't know really what it is or why it interests you. And part of the writing process is to work out what it is that interests you. So it's a bit like starting with this very undefined piece of stone or marble, and you chip away at it. So gradually this kind of shape emerges, That's one way I think about it. I guess the other way I think of it is that I start intuitively. As I've suggested, I start without really knowing where I'm going. It's a journey into the unknown every time. And the first 2 drafts feel like that. They feel exciting, like an exploration. And then gradually, from being intuitive, I become more and more rational as the drafts go on. So that by the end, I've turned from this kind of intuitive writer into a kind of critical, rational writer. Ideally, the most ruthless critic of my own work that I could possibly be.
In terms of your body of work, do you believe you have a general mission for all of the books, or a theme that you're trying to hit on?
Do I have a mission or a message in my work? I'm really suspicious of people who say they do have messages, because I sort of think novels aren't about message. Journalism is about a message or a mission, and if you've got ideas, and those kind of ideas, I think you express them in journalistically. I think a novel is a different animal. I mean, I also don't really like to look back. I mean, moments like this, of course, I'm being asked to look back and kind of look back over what is now 10 books. And it's kind of dangerous, because I think it sort of hamstrings you, for your future work. I prefer to forget everything I've ever done, and the book I'm doing now, which is the book Beyond Secrecy, is the only one that interests me. And Secrecy already has sort of retreated a bit into the past, and it's not quite got to the stage where I open it up and can't recognise the words. I mean, that certainly happens with some of my older books. If I look at something I wrote in the 90s, open it, I might think, oh, that's quite good, but I can't remember having written it for the life of me. I think rather than saying the novel has a message, I would say that fiction has a purpose. I mean, I would say that, and it's an idea that I've sort of been thinking about recently, and it's sort of just gradually emerged, is that there's something about fiction that is moral, which is that you're basically, when you write a novel, inviting someone to spend time in someone else's head. And if the fiction is really effective, if it's working at its best, then the reader of a book will enter someone else's life and live that life. So it's the idea is that you enter someone else's shoes and live another life. And I think, in a strange way, that's the way in which, I mean, fiction can teach compassion in that sense.
This Party's Got to Stop played with the mechanics of the memoir, introducing a meta non-fiction narrative.
It was my first venture into non-fiction, you know, and I had felt for 20 years, 25 years, that I had a unique story to tell that was true, because myself and my two brothers had both moved back into the childhood home when my father died, my mother being already dead. So we were orphans suddenly in our 20s, and we all oddly lived there together in Eastbourne for 7 months, and there were actually 5 of us because my youngest brother was married with a baby. It was a very anarchic time. It was melancholy and tender at certain moments, but then it would veer into mayhem and, you know, chaos at other moments, and very fluid, very unpredictable. And I just thought, as an angle on grief and loss, as an angle on the death of people close to you, this was a really, really interesting take on the whole subject. But when it came to write the book, again, I wrote a couple of drafts intuitively, what I thought the book should be. Just simply an account of this chaotic summer in Eastbourne. 5 go mad in Eastbourne, what someone later described it as. And oddly, that just didn't work. I read it back to myself, and it was like a badly sprung bed. You know, it started quite strongly with the funeral of my father. It ended really strongly with his bed being burned on a bonfire at the end of our garden as we left the house 7 months later. But in between, it kind of sagged, you know, it didn't have the tension a book needs, and I was really surprised by that and didn't really know what to do about it. So I stopped, and I went away and I wrote the first draft of a novel. The moment I'd finished the first draft of that novel, I thought, no, damn it, I'm going to go back to that memoir. I've got to do it. It's now or never. You know, this is the moment. The central problem, I think, was, and you alluded to it in your question about putting yourself at the heart of a book. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. Secondly, I didn't know how to use my imagination. You know, I was used to going wherever I want with a book, no matter how crazy it seems to begin with. You know, I would make it work. With the memoir, with a real life story, obviously you're tied to all these things that really happened. So how does the imagination fit in with that? You know, if you're simply recreating things from the past. And it took me probably 18 months to work out how. And the answer was probably in the structure. The answer was, the book gradually became a kind of extraordinary mosaic, where running through the whole book was this thread of the 7 months in 1984 when we were dealing with the death of my father. That was just a thread, though, and dotted all. I then moved back as far as 1960s when I was a little boy, right forwards to almost now, you know, and also moved all over the world from Berlin to New York to Shanghai, in an attempt to kind of throw light on those 7 months, you know. And that, in the end, was the way that the book worked, was by juxtaposing lots of pieces of incidents from my family history. Sometimes it was me going to see an old relation and asking questions. Sometimes it was simply a little memory that became a chapter on its own. And by juxtaposing those in the right way, I got the right tension, and I think the book worked.
Zummo, your protagonist in Secrecy, finds beauty and art in dark places, and your work often explores the darker side of human nature. Are you inspired by visual art?
There's so many answers to that question. I was attracted to Zummo, first of all, not because he was an artist. I mean, I was attracted to him because there was a mystery about his life. He's one of those, as I've said earlier, he's a real person. He really existed in the 17th century. But biographical details were scarce and often contradictory. What I did find out was that he'd left Sicily, where he was born, when he was about 19 or 20, because of an irksome episode or mishap. This is what the sources say. They don't say what that episode was. But it has to have been something quite serious, because he went on this northward journey up through Italy, Naples, Florence, Genoa. He died in Paris, so it's a northward journey away from Sicily. He never ever returned. So my sense of him, what attracted me to Zummo was not the fact he was a visual artist, but the fact that he was a fugitive, a man on the run, possibly from his past, a man who almost had a sore neck from looking over his shoulder, you know, because he kept thinking that his past was catching up with him. I think that was almost enough for me to begin with, because with any fictional character, all I need is a few psychological clues and then plenty of space to walk into, and with Zummo, I had both, you know, even though he was a real person, which is quite unusual, because I found out as much as I could about him, but there wasn't much to find out, you know, and even when I knew everything there was to know, he was still an enigma, you know. So it wasn't just his life was poorly documented. There was also something deeply enigmatic about him, and that was enough to bring me in. But then, I think then I started looking at the art that he produced, and he made these amazingly graphic, but also very tactile plague pieces. So they'd be wooden cabinets, about this big, filled with the bodies of the dead and dying. That makes it sound very macabre, you know, and Marquis de Sade did love them 150 years later when he saw them. Put them in one of his books. But if you look at the art, if you look beyond the darkness and the macabre aspects of it, there's a kind of sensual quality in the work, because something about the way these figures are rendered, you know, there's something flamboyant, something exhibitionist about them that makes you start wondering again, you know, about what kind of man this is. And so it's no wonder that one of the things that drives Secrecy is this very powerful, thwarted love story. Because I looked at Zumbo's work and I thought of sensuality. I thought there's a sensual side to this man, and I immediately started thinking there was a potential for a love story, which of course in Florence of that time is about the most dangerous thing you can do, because sex, you know, was forbidden. Sex outside marriage was forbidden, and you could be killed for it. So I love the idea of this fugitive man on the run, not just with stuff behind him that's threatening him, but arriving in Florence and getting caught up in a passionate relationship that could also jeopardize his career, if not his life.